And the topic is environmental stewardship amid a climate emergency, and the various themes that tie in with that. Our panel moderator tonight is Christine Boyle, a Vancouver City Councillor. Christine was elected to the Vancouver City Council back in 2018 municipal elections. She is a climate justice advocate, a United Church minister, and a community organizer. And Christine has an amazing background with a Bachelor's of Science in Urban Architecture and First Nation Studies from the University of British Columbia, and a Master's in Religious Leadership for Social Change from the Graduate Theology Union in Berkeley, California. So I think very well suited for this panel and this event, and a wonderful ally for our communities and for environmental work across the province. We're also going to welcome back MLA Sonia Furstenau, leader of the Green Party of British Columbia again. We have Victoria City Councillor Shamarke Dubo. Shamarke is a Somali-Canadian politician and human rights activist. He cast his first vote ever after coming to Canada as a refugee from originally from Somalia on October 20th, 2018, and at the same time was elected as a city councillor in Victoria. He's the first Black city councillor to be elected in Victoria in 152 years, as well as the first Muslim city councillor. Shamarke sits on various regional service and civic committees, including recently serving the Victoria Regional Transit Commission, which plays a large part in, transit plays a huge part in environmentalism and solving that. Outside of his civic duties, he's a board member of the Victoria Coalition for Survivors of Torture, the Broadbent Institute, the Climate Caucus, and the Vancouver Island Human Rights Coalition. He is a longtime former board member of the Canadian Council for Refugees. Interesting thing for us to be aware of is that in today's world, there's about 80 million forcibly displaced people and refugees. Within 8 to 9 years, that's going to be 300 million. And that statistic includes the vast majority of them being climate change refugees. So he is also sitting on the board of the Climate Caucus, which is a nonpartisan network of 300 plus locally elected climate leaders, driving systems change to help improve and transform our communities within the next decade. We'd also like to welcome back Kyle Impiringham from the Starfish Canada to the panel, and Sukhmeet Singh Sachal, so Abhijit's brother. Welcome, thank you very much for joining us. Sukhmeet is a 24-year-old humanitarian, public health advocate and environmental advocate. With his brother, he traveled to the Arctic, but he lived a lot longer there. I think it was 6 months that you stayed, and in Inuvik, so in the Northwest Territories, teaching biology, physics, and environmental sciences with Indigenous youth at a local high school there. And with his brother, he also co-created Break the Divide to help connect youth in North America to focus on topics of climate change, effects on mental health, and what solutions can be. So we are honored to have all of you here today with us. I'm going to pass it on to Christine to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. And as others have said, it is just a total joy and honor to be in this conversation with all of these folks. I was finding myself a bit weepy at many of your words in the moment that we're in. So am so grateful. I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and like others, hold the weight of what it means to live on stolen land, with the histories we continue to reckon with. I hold that heavily this week and always, quite frankly, and am glad to hear so many folks weave that into these conversations about faith and climate action. So I get to moderate rather than talking much myself. I love that role. And thought I would, I'm gonna throw a question to each of our panelists first, and then we can kind of respond and engage in the way that Zoom sort of allows you to do. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure we won't have time to say all the things we could, and we'll just make do. So Shamarke, I'm hoping we can hear from you first, and particularly wonder what you have to say and what you hope we should hear about the impacts of the climate emergency on people around the world, and the impact that's having in terms of climate refugees, what that means for our families and communities abroad, as well as here in local governments and in our communities.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Christine. Thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be among friends, and I'm gratefully could say I know each one of you, and it gives me such a pleasure to really share space with you and bring us together so that we could have this conversation. But I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm joining upon virtually, and I want to acknowledge and show my respect and gratitude to the Longkwangans people whose traditional territory that I am, that I work, live, and build relationships, and I'm able to navigate, operate, and exist. The Songhees, Squamish, Saganese people whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day, and to those of us who came here as settlers, as immigrants, either in this generation or in generation past, and to those of us who came here involuntarily, either as a result of transatlantic slave trade or from persecution from their homelands. And I make this acknowledgement not as some sort of historical footnote, but really as commitment to true and lasting reconciliation with indigenous people, and someone who moved to Canada 8 years ago and have a history of uprooted from my own homeland as a child and being in different countries for 20 years and seeking a place that I'm able to call home. I always ask myself, what is my role and how could I be the best Canadian that I could be than now that I'm a citizen? And always my answer comes into the best Canadian I could be is to play a role in reconciliation and learn the history of the country that I call home today. And speaking of that, and also I want to really speak as we speaking about climate justice, and Suzanne early talk about trees and planting, and it really reminded me a Somali poet, and his name is Daliyat, and connecting to that the horrific founding of the 215 children, he had a quote, and he said, even among plants, there is a revered tree that is spared the hidden. So too are there among people those who are immune from violence and should not be subjected to abuse. And he was talking about children, that every child deserves to have a home, respected and safe, and protected their well-being. And as someone who was uprooted in my own homeland as a refugee, and it's not only that I'm uprooted from my home, but the communities. And I remember as a child, your neighbor is also your parents. People know you by name, and they know who your parents were, which house you live, and so that sense of connection with the community, but also sense of connection to the land, the farms my family and had, and that we used to go on the weekend, and also the streets that I play when it rains, and all those things. When you are uprooted and live with a sadden that as a child you don't even decide, and that is what the reality that refugee children face, which are half of the population today. So to me, each of the 215 children has a name, has a family, has a connection to community, land, and nation, and they're all loved. And we cannot forget that, because when we talk about numbers, it's not only statistical, and it is more than that. And as a country that I call home, Canada, today, we need to get really serious and put the TRC call to justice into action, and importantly, listen to the indigenous voices and communities, and really be serious where our policies and our actions, and how does even our budgets reflect to the policies that we want to make real change. I just wanted to share that at the get-go. But in coming back to your question, Christine, and I've been, it's a very important question, and I would say I will break it to 3 points when we talk about our responsibilities and to the global south, and what we do here at the global north. The 3 points is, as a contributor to climate change, is very important to, when we talk about climate change, to speak about that, and how do we contribute to that and add to the greenhouse. And the challenges that people spoke earlier is that when we, as a cities, for instance, I'm a city leader and I'm elected and in city of Victoria, and the cities are forefront when it comes to any change and any challenge that we speak of in the world. And the climate change poses the greatest environmental challenge, and not only the heating of the Earth's atmosphere, but from global burning fossil and the greed and the big corporation. So taking a climate leadership and of the question, how do we contribute to climate change, is very important. And at the City of Victoria, we are playing a role such as low carbon, high performance building, low carbon mobility, low carbon waste management, and even including demoviction, and how do we really think about circular economy, and think about municipal and adaptations and operations. But the biggest challenge I see, as someone who's getting into this work in terms of policy, but climate has affected me because of the scarcity, and that's what creates conflicts, that's what creates droughts and all that, and which I'm not going to go into that, but because of that is where conflict happens and what creates displacement. So the biggest challenge in policy, and which Kyle spoke about earlier, is the creating a framework to assess climate action with an equity lenses. And that is where the biggest challenge of all levels of government, federal, provincial, and local government, is struggling. And the other thing is that the cities being in front line, and we don't have a lot of power of how we should reduce emissions. And that is one of the biggest challenges. And Vancouver has a Vancouver Charter, which gives them some power, but the rest of municipalities in BC, and we don't have so much of a power to do the work we want to do. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the donor community. so that if we contribute a lot to the climate change, but then what are we doing in terms of to play the global change, and how are we funding and doing investment in the global south and invest in communities, civil societies and groups are really at forefront in tackling climate change, and how do we really fund those? And I was very fortunate for me outside of my city work to be Global Cities Fund for Inclusive Pandemic Response when the COVID-19 hit. And the idea was to fund cities and municipalities that are really forefront. And I want to share, we've chosen 5, and the group is through the migration, the Mayor's Migration Task Force. And one of the cities that was chosen was Freetown in Sierra Leone, and they got one of the funding cities to fund. And the Global City Fund for Inclusive Pandemic was $1 million initiative to respond to unmet needs of cities as they support migrants, refugees, and internally displaced. So what the Freetown did was to work with internally displaced people and refugees and use the fund to expand its waste management macro enterprise program to ensure more youth living in formal settlement, many of whom are rural migrants, access to the opportunity to jointly improve their livelihood and the public health of their communities now and in the future. So it's really important that when the Global North do funding, to really look at communities that are impacted and how are we really funding those cities who face, because the 85% of the refugees end up in developing countries and the least developing countries. They don't come to the Western countries and Global North. The number is small compared to what Uganda or Kenya or other countries in the developing countries would receive. And the other one is in terms of receiving refugees. And it's very important to speak about, because when we speak about climate change and climate crisis, we cannot separate racism and discrimination of the work we do, and how environmental crisis and racism is one of the many challenges that people of color, indigenous, Black face all the time. And sometimes it really makes it hard. So when people come and seek asylum or move to Global North, then you see a lot of countries closing their doors to the refugees and having policies that tense back people. And it's very important that we have to really think how racialized people who are third generation, fourth generation, and that live in countries that has highest emissions, and how are we implementing programs and policies that support that, such as public transit and addressing racism and equity together. And we have to address them together because they're really interconnected issue. Both the climate crisis and racism are rooted in history of colonialism, as Sonia clearly and very clearly and historically spoke about, and extraction and exploitation. So it is important to recognize that these histories have continued and still are impacting people today. They're not only history, they are impacting indigenous community now. So just to conclude, how our actions even impact is that Canada still has numerous mining interests overseas in African countries. And these economic activities have impact on environmental health of those communities across the world and displacement. And one other thing that Kyle and Sonia really touched was the idea of silos and trade-offs and where we prioritize. So we can't afford to take single issue approach when we want to respond to crisis, because business as usual doesn't work for anyone. And single issue approach and silos, to be honest, we don't have the time, and we can't live single issue lives because those are impacted interactionality.
Thank you so much, Shamarke. I wish we got to be in the same room to have more of this conversation. I'm always grateful for the way that you pull threads together and connect all of these issues in your own life and in your leadership in the community. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask a question of Sukhmeet next, and I know it's weighty to follow your younger sibling, so no pressure, but we're delighted to have you here, and I'm really excited to hear from you. I'm wondering if you can speak to us a bit about your own personal journey as a young climate leader, and of course take that wherever you want, but really excited to hear some more of your own story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it, the honor and the opportunity to be here amongst all of you amazing people. And I agree, it is definitely a hard act to follow. My brother, who speaks phenomenally, and I cannot follow that, but I will try my best. My journey really started, and I've been reflecting on the title of this event, Saving Our Planet, Faith in Action, since I was asked to speak here. And I've really been reflecting on the key moments in my life, on how these two worlds have been intersecting in my life. And so it really started actually when I was in grade 7. And this is a moment that I often forget, but it was my teacher who reminded me of this, and this small action that I took in my elementary school that helped make a difference. And so in grade 7, there were a lot of my Indigenous friends in my class that were being bullied. And this was something that really bothered me, because when I immigrated to Canada from India, I was bullied for wearing a turban, for my Indian accent, for the food that I ate. And so I already knew how it felt to be bullied, and I really didn't want other people in my class to be bullied in the same way. And so these Indigenous students in my class, my friends, I really wanted to do something for them. And again, in grade 7, like, I had no idea that this would leave an impact or anything. I was 12 years old or 11, I don't remember exactly, but I went up to my teacher and I asked my teacher, I'm like, we need to do something for the Indigenous students in our class. And she's like, this is the first time I'm ever hearing this, that there's this, this Indian kid that wants to do something for the Indigenous students. And she's like, okay, like, let's do something. And so we ended up doing a powwow dance where elders came, and it was the first time in my elementary school where Indigenous peoples were really being celebrated. And in this powwow dance, I was the only non-Indigenous person dancing on the stage at first with my Indigenous friends. But by the end of the entire assembly, the entire school was up on their feet and joining in on this dance. And why I'm sharing this story is because this moment really highlighted the importance for me for recognizing that Indigenous peoples have been living here forever. And it was at this moment where I actually met the elders who came to the school, and they were teaching people about their histories, about how they've been living their lives on the land. And I think this is really the defining moment where I really started understanding about environmentalism. I still remember that there was a teepee set up in the school soccer field, and we all got to go in there as students. We were all so excited. We're like, wow, what's in there? And they all had these traditional medicines over there. And they were just explaining to us how they rely on a lot of things from the land. They had traditional foods available as well that were very sustainable and harvested from the land as well. And that's where I really understood the connection of how important it is to be living off the land for them. And this made me reflect on my ancestors back in India, where I'm from. And I realized how people in Punjab are reliant on farms over there for sustainable living. And so these are the connections that I started to create. And as I continued my journey, when I went to high school, I joined all these different programs, whether that was my school's global awareness committee, or started the Surrey Sustainability Network, or joined the Metro Vancouver Youth Sustainability Network. And this is the platforms that I really found were so helpful for me. I met youth from all across Vancouver and the Lower Mainland who were doing amazing things, and it really inspired me. I think that's where I actually met Kyle as well. And it was just amazing to see all these incredible people doing these things. And so I think that's really what motivated me to continue doing this work. And it wasn't until, like my brother mentioned about Break the Divide before, I spent 6 months living in the Arctic in 2017. And this is where I felt that I was finally starting to understand what climate change was all about. And so during this time, I was spending up there teaching Indigenous youth sciences, whether that be biology, chemistry, physics, and environmental sciences. And I started doing this program over there where I was talking to Indigenous youth and asking them, what are the things that are troubling you in your community? What are the things that we can do together to help uplift everyone around us? And so they were really starting to have these conversations with me about climate change, about mental health, about reconciliation. And this is when my brother was actually just coming back from the Arctic as well. And we thought, why not have these conversations between kids in my brother's school and the kids that I'm teaching up here in the Arctic? And so we started with a small dialogue. Literally the first call that we had was in 2017, where these youth were just talking to each other and they were asking the most random questions. Youth in Delta, BC were asking their friends in Inuvik, do you live with pet polar bears? Like, how do you get to your school? Like, what do you do up there? Because I guess these are things that were not being taught in our social studies textbooks. And so this is where we realized, we're like, wow, this is creating a powerful conversation that has never existed before, where we're connecting youth in the Arctic with youth in British Columbia. And what we realized most about this, like my brother mentioned, we're all about turning empathy into action. We realized that after we created this conversation, youth in British Columbia really wanted to do something for now their friends living in the Arctic. So they started holding mental health nights in their school for the first time ever, where they were talking about how in the Arctic, suicide rates are 11 times higher than the national average in Canada, and how climate change is exacerbating these impacts. And so these are the conversations we realize are so important. Fast forward to now, we're in over 10 countries around the world, where we are now connecting youth across the world to talk about climate change, to talk about mental health, to talk about reconciliation. And now I think what's happened right now with the 215 children's bodies that have been found, I think it's really ignited a fire in all the people living, not only in Canada, but across the world, to realize that we all have a duty to uplift one another during these times. And I think with COVID now, what I think faith in action really means to me is something that's happened during this past year. A lot of the times, especially during times of crisis, people who are religious, they rely on their religious places, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're Sikh, whether you're Jewish, whether you're a Christian, and so forth. People like to go to the religious places, or they like to be in a congregation where they can learn from one another, where they can share their grievances, where they can share their hardships. And it was in June of 2020 when I went into the Gurdwara, and I started an initiative called the COVID-19 Sikh Gurdwara Initiative. And here it started because I went into the Gurdwara and I asked one of the elders, how come you're not wearing a mask? How come you're not following the social distancing protocols? And he simply told me in Punjabi, he's like, well, there's not a mask that's available for me to tie around my turban. And all the protocols that are being said on the TV are all being done in English or in French. So it's not something that they could understand. And that's when I was like, wow, like these are things that the government or no one even thought about. Like they're missing a huge population that needs to be really getting the messaging. And so I started an initiative. As a medical student, I knew I couldn't be in the hospital right now because my training is not that far yet, but I knew with my public health background, I had to do something about this. And so I gathered over 150 youth volunteers, and we went into these gurdwaras on the weekends, where we then educated the public about COVID-19 in a culturally effective way in Punjabi and Hindi and Urdu, for instance. We're really teaching these public now about COVID-19, and people were finally starting to understand what COVID-19 was all about. And the only reason now why I'm sharing this story is now, fast forward to now, we've advocated to the government now to have vaccine clinics, to Fraser Health as well, to have vaccine clinics in places of worship. And they finally started doing it. Now vaccine clinics are now happening in gurdwaras and mandirs and mosques and churches. Why? Because it's a place where people feel comfortable, where people now can take action and get their vaccines, for instance. And the only reason I'm sharing this entire story from this past year is because I believe faith is so important in times of crisis. Climate crisis is the most important crisis we are ever facing. COVID-19 is something that now we're finally feeling, but the climate crisis is going to be something that's going to surpass this to another level that we've never imagined before, where concepts like solastalgia, the feeling of being at home but not really being at home, are going to be impacting people's mental health. And so I think faiths during these times need to band together like we are right now, having these important conversations, which I think are so important. And what I've learned over this past year is people in communities of faith, they have so much power, but they don't have the opportunities to unleash them. And I think we need to continue having these conversations with different faith groups to allow these conversations to happen, because I know that we can actually save our planet if we continue to have these faiths in action and continue to move forward. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Sukhmeet, that was amazing. Thank you for all of those words, but even more so the leadership that you're providing on so many different fronts, and your articulation of how these issues overlap and hit the ground for people in communities, and then how you show up with community to address them. It's really, really powerful. Thank you for all of that. I'm gonna move to Kyle next. And Kyle, I wonder, there are so many questions I would ask of each of you. Kyle, I was struck by when you spoke earlier, your articulation of the shift that is needed and that we're in, hopefully from the environmental movement of the past to the climate justice movement of today. And I'd be interested to hear, in your experience in this work, how we work and learn across generations in that shift and in the very urgent and intersectional work that we need to be doing.
Thanks, Christine, and as always, great to see you. So I was tapped on the shoulder to be the youth representative on this is a lot of words, Environment and Climate Change Canada's expert panel on climate change adaptation and resilience. I almost run out of breath saying it. And it was a great privilege to be a part of it. And through that experience, I learned about in firsthand how sometimes we put the youth representative as the youth representative, and for the reason, although all done with good intentions, sometimes it comes into this like tokenistic way, or the youth voice has to adapt to the voices in the room, and there's a lot of other dynamics that have come in. One of the ones that I loved once was that we were in a conversation, and I grew up in a space where I always have felt rude interrupting people. I'm not very good at doing that. I was in a space in Ottawa, of all places, and everyone consistently talked over each other. I wasn't finding space to talk. One time someone just leaned over to me and was like, you need to interrupt people if you want to talk, right? No one's going to make space for you. And recognizing that moment, I was like, wow, why not? Like, why do I have to? I don't think it's fair to ask the youngest voice in the room and that they have to interrupt. And so there's things there that are a little bit generational. I do think that there's a certain element of how things have sort of progressed as we've created governments and in different spaces, and how we've interacted with each other in order to create progress, recognizing that some of that progress was good and some of it was not. Yusuf talked about I think you said the word like reverse mentoring in one moment there. And that's one of the things that I think is also a part of the dynamic shift and that we're trying to build in, is that young people do want to learn. They're not people like, young people don't come in most of the time, and this is a generality, but I think they come in wanting to learn. I don't think they think that they have all the answers, but they think that they have ideas. And I think sometimes, we want to, like, as young people, we want to be able to share our ideas and be able to be genuinely heard. I think many people recognize that every time you share an idea doesn't mean it's exactly going to be implemented the way that you said it should. But if we can create space for inclusion, for people to just have conversation and have understanding of each other, that's what we're after. And we know we can make better outcomes when we do that. And so I think that's the generational shift I see. We have run a mentorship program here at the Starfish Canada and the best news we got back from it was when the mentors told us that they felt they actually learned more. They felt like they almost did nothing and that they were the mentee. That to me was very heartwarming to know that, we brought people into space to learn from a lot of our top 25 environmentalists under 25 winners, and who said that they would like mentorship to accelerate to the next stage of their career. And one of the biggest outcomes for a mentor was that they learned a lot along the way. I think when we take that mindset that we're all in this together, that there is not one voice, even, and I say it with a lot of love and kindness to elected officials who often are in seats of power. Sometimes people think that, like, you have all the answers, you must tell us, we put you in there because but really, and as you all have done and shown in a lot of the work I've seen over the years, you believe in community. You think that a lot of community has a part of that answer. And that's why I think a lot of people gravitate towards empathetic leaders like yourselves, is because that it's about community and building that together. It's not about gaps. It's about creating space for each other.
Thank you so much for that, and all of your leadership too, Kyle. I'm always glad, even though we're separated by some water, to get to be in conversation with you. And such a perfect lead into closing with Sonia, who I too am constantly inspired by as a empathetic and grounded leader in her work, who I think, like me, knows we don't actually really have all the answers, but we listen and learn as we go. Sonia, I'm curious, I wrote down when you were speaking earlier a line you said, which was that we will write a better story if we're writing it together. And it's a message I heard articulated in a slightly different way from nearly all of our speakers, and that I know, or that I see you leading with in the work you're doing. I wonder if you have okay, so this is going to slightly go against what I just said about how we're learning as we go too, but I'm curious if you have advice or lessons you've learned along the way that you want to lift up for the rest of us as we do this work together.
Thanks, Christine, and what an inspiring evening this has been. Every single one of you have just spoken words that have penetrated my heart. I feel more hopeful now than I did 2 hours ago, so thank you for that. I think so much of what has been talked about this evening really reflects, for me, a lot of my experiences and a lot of what I would say we should be learning. Sukhmeet and your brother, the idea of empathy, being rooted in empathy, is, I think, so essential. We tend to engage in conflict or engage in challenges with a kind of dehumanizing or make an enemy of the people that disagree with us, as opposed to saying, okay, I want to hear where you're at and why you're there, and then I want to figure out how we can work together to find a solution. And I think Suzanne's wisdom that she brings and is really what all of us, I think this is going to be my motto going forward, is just be the forest, right? The forest, every part of the forest interacts with every other part and supports and connects. And it's not like I'm looking out, like the arbutus tree says to the cedar tree, you know, get out of here. We don't want you here. The arbutus tree and the cedar tree kind of work together and figure out how they can support each other. And so much of, like, I think back to Sean again, and this was really where I spent a lot of time on the activist side of thing, and trying to get a government to listen, hell, as you say, like, people elected don't have all the answers. And it was fairly early on that I realized anger, hatred were not going to sustain us, and that we had to operate always from a place of kindness and empathy, compassion, love, create the future that we were wanting, that we were standing up and fighting for, and then approach those elected people with that empathy and with solutions, with an understanding of the challenges that they face in the roles that they're in. And Shamarki and Christine, I know you know all of this very well. People think that we can solve everything instantly. We can't. And to come with solutions. And I think since taking on this role of leader of our party, I talk a lot about purpose and joy. Just root the work in purpose. Have a sense of where you want to get to. What does that future look like? What does it feel like? How is it going to be for all of us when we're there? And then remember that this hard work of trying to make positive change in the world has to come with joy attached to it. And I thank all of you for the joy of this evening, and Yusuf for the joy that you continually bring when you bring people together. We are facing a lot of crises right now. The environmental crisis, the climate crisis, our social crisis, inequality crisis. And crises can operate to pull us together where we see that shared humanity and that shared mission, or they can drive us apart because of fear and because of our sense of, you know, how do I take care of myself and my loved ones? And I think all of us need to lean into being the forest. We need to pull each other together in the face of these crises and recognize that we can build something very, very beautiful on the other side.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was a perfect way to wrap this up. And I'm actually not going to try to say anything more to close. That was really moving. And thank you.